Joining me now, NBC's Ryan Riley, former federal prosecutor, MSNBC legal analyst Paul Butler, and MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. So, Lisa, I don't need to tell you, you were in that room for the trial day after day after day. So you watched the relationship between Donald Trump, his lawyer Todd Blanche, Emil Bovee. Talk a little bit about that, what it's like, and what it could mean, do you think, at the Department of Justice?
Todd Blanche has an unusually strong relationship with Donald Trump. Donald Trump, as we covered at the time, Chris, was unhappy to be in the courtroom most of the time, morose much of the time. And yet there were moments where he laughed and lightened up. And that was largely when he was talking to Todd Blanche sitting right next to him.
Often really close.
Really close together, whispering to each other so they couldn't be detected. I joked at the time that their relationship was almost bromantic in its closeness and in its joviality. But why that matters is because at the Department of Justice, there are protocols about who can talk to the White House about ongoing cases. And under existing department policy, who can talk to the White House at the Department of Justice? Well, that's the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General. And the only people those people are supposed to talk to about ongoing litigation are the White House counsel or his deputy or the president himself. Okay. So lots of reliance by Donald Trump on Todd Blanche will go into the future in terms of who's able to pick up the phone and even talk about what's going on at the department.
So, Paul, this is what Todd Blanche told my colleague, Savannah Guthrie, about Trump and his violations of the gag order against him after the hush money conviction back in May.
He's trying to get elected. And so it's not my job to tell him how to communicate to the American people about why they should view this case as something that is other than the right thing and the right way that District Attorney Bragg should be handling cases, and the judge as well. So you're right.
I mean, is it a smart strategy to stand on the courthouse steps and rip the judge who's going to sentence you and decide your fate and freedom in 6 weeks?
I mean, you say rip the judge, but it's also President Trump expressing his very strong views about why he didn't get a fair shake. So, yes, it's a strong strategy.
So, look, that's an example of Blanche defending Trump outside the court of law. That's what defense attorneys are paid to do, right? But we also know, Paul, that Donald Trump has not been happy with DOJ in his first term. He believes that he should have someone acting essentially as his personal lawyer. How complicated could this get?
So, look, Todd Blanche and Emil Bovee are both former federal prosecutors who any Republican president might have considered. But if Matt Gaetz is confirmed as AG, he will be their boss. So they will have to answer to him. As a defense attorney for Donald Trump, they marched to Trump's orders, even when it wasn't in the best interest of their client, leading to their client's conviction for felonies. So the question is whether these lawyers will be able to say no when Trump asked them to do something illegal or unconstitutional. Because neither of Trump's previous attorney generals were models of integrity, but both Jeff Sessions and Bill Barr had the fortitude to stand up to Trump at critical moments. I don't know if we have evidence that this new proposed team by Trump would respect this bedrock principle of our democracy. When you work for the Department of Justice, your client is the United States of America, not the president.
And Lisa, the difference, obviously, between Todd Blanche and Matt Gaetz is Blanche actually does have experience as a prosecutor. So if Blanche's nomination is confirmed before Gaetz's, which is possible, given the controversy surrounding Matt Gaetz, he could serve as acting attorney general. How would that work?
Well, that's right. So under federal statute, there is a specific statute that talks about the succession plan at the Department of Justice. And so if the attorney general position is open by virtue of resignation or death or removal of somebody, the person who sits as deputy attorney general gets to be the acting attorney general. And here you can envision a scenario where it behooves the Trump administration to try and confirm Todd Blanche as soon as possible so that he can start the department on the foot that Donald Trump wants it to start on, even if Matt Gaetz lingers for some period of time. The other thing, Chris, that I think people need to know is there's something called the Federal Vacancies Reform Act that generally says anybody serving in an acting capacity has 210 days, and then they got to get out of there. But there's a question about the Department of Justice because there's a specific statute related to DOJ. Is that time delimited? That's an open legal question. And so Todd Blanche could be the confirmed deputy AG, but serving as the attorney general for some unlimited period of time. And a court has yet to determine how those two statutes interact.
Yeah, so what you have, Paul, is someone who argued his case for Trump in Supreme Court, the others who defended Trump against DOJ in their cases against him, folks who could have key roles in the agency, and, of course, Matt Gaetz, who we know is a loyalist who has thought that there was a witch hunt going on. So what could all that do to the cases, the personnel who worked on them, the evidence?
So Donald Trump has said that he wants to go after people who he perceives as his political enemies, and Gaetz would be the AG of Trump's dreams. He's an attack dog who would weaponize the DOJ to go after anyone Donald Trump doesn't like. And Chris, you might think, well, why would anybody be worried if they haven't actually committed a crime? Just being the subject of a federal criminal investigation can ruin your life financially and personally. And that seems like the kind of vintage Donald Trump promise on the campaign trail.
Ryan, then we have the January 6 cases. We've heard a couple of different things, or multiple different things, from Donald Trump. What's the latest on the potential for him to pardon January 6 defendants?
You know, what's interesting is, like, some of my sources on sort of what we call both sides here, both within the Justice Department and supporters of January 6 defendants, are very much so on the same page about what Matt Gaetz would mean for the Justice Department. I had one ally of January 6 defendants, actually the wife of the first defendant who went to trial, describe on January 6 charges, describe Matt Gaetz as a wrecking ball in a positive matter. And that's kind of what I think the Justice Department employees are really feeling today. There's, this is sort of almost in bizarro world, I think, that this could possibly be Matt Gaetz, because it's just, it really is. It was that last minute pick. It was really out of left field. But I mean, he's been a strong advocate for January 6 defendants all the way throughout. He spread lies initially on January 6 itself. He suggested even that he on Twitter that he had spoken with Donald Trump during the actual attack. He said several of us spoke with Trump during the attack, referring to fellow Republicans. And then he spread lies about this being the work of Antifa under, pretending to be Trump supporters, and then he held a press conference outside of DOJ. So this goes on and on. For the past 3 years, he's hosted this right-wing former speechwriter for the White House and spread a lot of these conspiracy theories, including about Ray Epps, including about some of the pipe bombs, saying that was some sort of federal setup. So every conspiracy theory associated with January 6, Matt Gaetz has really been at the forefront of that, usually alongside Marjorie Taylor Greene. So you really can't understate what this could potentially mean for the January 6th investigation.
Ryan Riley, Paul Butler, Lisa Rubin, thank you all.